Welcome to this video about the proposed emergency letdown procedure for VFR-in-IMC situations. For the record, I'm filming this on February 23rd of 2021. So one of the tools that I want controllers to have available is this procedure whereby we let somebody down with a controlled descent through the clouds. The goal, very simply, is to allow a stable descent for this airplane. Typically a VFR pilot in an instrument-capable airplane stuck on top of an overcast layer, though there can be other situations. They get through the cloud layer, they get to VFR at an altitude that's safely underneath the clouds and simultaneously safely above local terrain and obstacles. Keep in mind, I always want to try to get people to VMC conditions and keep them there if at all possible. There are rare occasions where this will be the tool that is best called for. With that in mind, let's very quickly go over to the Airplane Flying Handbook. And in Chapter 17 about emergencies, under the section about inadvertent VFR flight into IMC, it does talk about descents. And one level, effectively, what this procedure is just this particular thing. So descents are very much the opposite of climbs if the airplane is properly trimmed. In this configuration, the airplane requires a certain amount of thrust to maintain altitude. The pitch attitude controls the airspeed, and the engine, therefore, maintains altitude. So if you reduce power, okay, the airspeed will remain, for all intents and purposes, the same. That will cause the nose to come down as it trims to maintain its trimmed airspeed. And the airplane then descends at a rate directly proportional to the amount of thrust that has been removed. Power reductions should typically be made in increments of 100 RPM or about 1 inch of manifold pressure, and the resulting rate of descent should never exceed 500 feet per minute. The wings should be held level on the attitude indicator, and the pitch attitude should not exceed 1 bar width below level. Now, in effect, this whole letdown procedure is just that. But obviously, I can't just walk away with a 30-second video. I got to do about 35 or 40 minutes, right? Seriously, though, there are some things to think about. But in essence, it's really that simple. Just keep the wings level, have it trimmed for a speed, pull the power back, descend, and that's really all there is to it. Of course, there's more to it than that, so let's talk about the details. Okay, so first of all, this is for emergency use only. I argue it's actually quite simple and quite safe. However, if this is not properly flown, or if a controller attempts to use it and doesn't really understand some of the subtle details, this maneuver, in all honesty, it can result in fatalities for everybody on board the aircraft. If you think through how that would actually happen, most likely it would be a structural breakup of the airplane in flight. That is, unfortunately, a ballistic fall to the ground with everybody on board fully conscious until they hit the ground and they know what's coming. And also, because we're talking about having big pieces of airplane fall to the ground, there is the potential for this to be fatal to people on the ground as well. I take this absolutely seriously, even though I argue that effectively it's really quite simple. Therefore, this is for emergency use only. Do not, under any circumstances, use this tool unless it's necessary and it's the least bad thing in some emergency situation. Now, the pilot is the pilot in command, and so effectively they can tell us that they're aware of the weather situation and they want to do this even though we are maybe recommending that they stay on top of an overcast layer, fly 100 miles away, descend down where it's VFR. So effectively the pilot can override us because truly they're the ones in charge. But generically speaking, I don't want controllers to rush into using this tool. And one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is in effect from my own personal legal liability. I don't want to give the impression that, oh, this is just a simple procedure. There's just 2 or 3 things to think about. You do it. It has a very high success rate. Because what's going to happen is if somebody ever botches it, somebody's going to come up to me and say, well, Dean, you gave the impression that this is really simple and not life-threatening. No, folks, this is life-threatening if you don't do it right. So pay attention, but ultimately it's pretty simple. Okay? Therefore, if you're going to use this, get management concurrence if possible. There might be occasions when somebody presents to a controller and they're practically on fumes on their gas level and there's an overcast layer and there's really no meaningful time. We've got to get going. Therefore, in those cases, consider stating something on a recorded line before using this tool. And that might be as simple as telling the pilot on frequency, which is of course a recorded line, that we're going to use this emergency letdown procedure because we'd like to keep them VFR, but their gas situation situation doesn't allow us any other choice under the circumstances. But generally speaking, try to get management concurrence if possible. The other thing to do, if at all possible, is I would greatly prefer that this be done by instrument-rated controllers. Now, if somebody shows up stuck on top of an overcast layer and they're down to their last 5 or 10 minutes of fuel, we can't spend 5 or 10 minutes paging some instrument-rated controller to the position, getting them plugged in, getting them briefed on what's going on, because by that time our pilots may be out of gas and it's made worse. But generally speaking, unless you've got something where it's truly time constrained, I don't want regular controllers. And again, no offense in any way, it's just there can be some little subtleties, and I really want instrument-rated controllers doing this if at all possible. If you're truly time constrained and you got to do it, then you got to do it, and so be it. All right. Weather requirements. So what are the weather requirements that I have in mind before we would consider using this tool? I have in mind a high expectation based on multiple METARs and or PIREPs around the area. I don't want to just look at one METAR, not pay any attention to the fact that some of these automated AWOS stations occasionally are let's say, rather optimistic, and it's an area where it's all IFR, and then you got one METAR sitting out there that makes it sound like it's much better. I want to have an awareness of what's going on regionally and so on. But as long as you have that awareness and there's a reasonably high expectation about, first of all, the ceiling. I really would like the ceiling to be at least 1,500 feet above ground level, preferably at least 2,000 feet. I'm not going to insist on that. If you have a different idea on this and would like to push it down, my personal bare minimum is about 1,200 feet AGL. Maybe you could talk me down to about 1,000 or so. But once you get below certainly 1,200, okay, I'm really thinking that we want to go to a different procedure, namely the emergency instrument approach procedure that I'll be talking about in a separate video. But assuming that the ceiling is at least 1,500 feet, preferably 2,000 feet or so, okay, you also want to use some common sense, so there is a judgment call about being aware about other clouds that are below the ceiling, because the ceiling, of course, is going to be the broken or overcast. You can have few clouds or scattered clouds down below that. So you just want to be aware of that. So for example, let's say we're looking at doing this and the area weather is something like 1,800-ish broken, okay, and there's few clouds at 900 feet. Those few clouds at 900 feet are really not a problem. I would just be aware of that ceiling. However, if it's scattered clouds at 500 feet, it becomes a little trickier, so I can't cover every possible situation. There will be a judgment call, but as long as they're above about 500 feet, especially if it's few clouds, I wouldn't worry about it. Scattered clouds is going to make us think about it a little bit. You also want to think about the visibility, and here there's a bit of a difference between daytime and nighttime. So the visibility, I would really like it to be at least 3 statute miles. I prefer 5, but I'll absolutely take 3 statute miles if we need to. The bare minimum is 1 statute mile, and that's even only during the day. If it's night, then 3 miles becomes the bare minimum. So daytime, 1 mile bare minimum. I'd really like to see at least 3, but nighttime, 3 miles bare minimum, and I really want to have at least 5. One way to put this visually, and I discuss this graphic in a separate video about finding VFR weather, this is what I have in mind. So if the visibility is at least 3 statute miles, and the ceiling, that is the broken or overcast, is underneath whatever aircraft it is that we're working in this emergency situation, but at least 1,500 feet AGL, then we can consider using this emergency letdown procedure. The entire goal is to get underneath the clouds. It's risky while they're in it, hence I've color-coded this red over here, but then they get underneath, it's VFR, I've color-coded this green. If the visibility is a bit lower, but at least 1 mile bare minimum in the day, you can consider using it. But again, once they get down below the clouds, now we're talking about, 1 to 2.5 miles visibility. It's kind of murky down there. I'm going to loosely call that marginal VFR once they get down below the clouds, but that's doable in the day. If it's nighttime, though, I would want to use the emergency instrument approach procedure with these lower visibility situations. With that in mind, let's just talk very briefly about this in a couple of different ways. So first of all, let me go to some live weather on aviationweather.gov. I did kind of briefly scout around to see if I could find anything that would meet what my current needs are for this particular video. And don't you know, most of the country is having a beautiful weather day, except kind of Western New York, which is about going to meet our needs. So You can kind of see here over in western Pennsylvania, kind of Erie and sort of south-ish of Erie, we've got a lot of places with about 10 miles visibility, and the ceiling is going to be something like overcast 2,200, overcast 2,100, overcast 2,200, and so on. Over here at Youngstown, it's broken at 2,900. But again, some regional awareness of this area kind of around Erie and to the south, that's an okay area to do this letdown maneuver if we need to. On the other hand, another one that I pre-scouted just before I started rolling here, look at Syracuse over here. Syracuse, it's showing 8 miles visibility, 1,800 for the ceiling, and there is overcast. But if you read the details, it says few clouds at 1,300, broken at 1,800 for the ceiling, and then also overcast at 2,500. I mean, that's doable, and frankly, you know, you could send somebody farther west, but again, here the cloud ceilings kind of fluctuate. So Syracuse at 1,800, yeah, Elmira's better at 28. Penyan, this is, yep, they still haven't updated this thing. It's an hour and a half old, but overcast 2,900. But basically, you know, Syracuse is kind of about the bare minimum. I'm not an expert on the terrain around Syracuse. I think it's relatively flat with some hills. So this is probably at 1,800, flirting with about as low as we could consider for that area before we would switch over to something like the emergency instrument approach procedure. But here again, it's got those few clouds at 1,300. Few, you can pretty much ignore. You might get a little unlucky. We'll talk about how to accommodate some bad luck in a couple of minutes in the video, but you can be aware of that. And in case you're wondering about where I'm getting some of these ideas about the visibility constraints, I'm not just plucking this out of thin air. If you look at the basic VFR weather minimums, and here, rather than go directly to the FARs, I'll pull up the AIM table 3-1-1. Class Gulf airspace, if they're 1,200 feet or less above the surface, for aircraft other than helicopters, day requires 1 statute mile and clear clouds. Effectively, I'm talking about getting somebody down below the clouds to about 1,200-ish feet or less above the surface and putting them in weather that's perfectly legal for them to take off and fly around in. Here, we're just kind of descending through the clouds in this VFR-in-IMC emergency and, you know, coming from above rather than from below to something that's perfectly legal. At night, the minimum visibility bumps up to 3 statute miles, and for what it's worth, you want to be 500 feet below the clouds. By the way, if we break out a little bit earlier, and therefore the airplane is more than 1,200 feet above the surface, and still assuming that they're less than 10,000 MSL, at night, the visibility requirement is still 1 statute mile, but also you need to be 500 feet below. That has as much to do with kind of a traffic separation thing as an airplane control thing, frankly. Okay, and if you're thinking about, well, you know, for Class B, C, D type stuff, ignore the B clear clouds. That 3 statute miles, that's really for, you know, visual separation, airplane to airplane in VFR conditions. But, of course, in some of these airspaces, you can get a special VFR clearance as a pilot. And what does that do? It knocks you down in the day to 1 statute mile clear clouds. Effectively, it turns that into Class Gulf airspace temporarily. So I argue in good faith that 1 mile clear clouds in the day or 3 miles at night is perfectly legal to take off and fly around in. Why can't we descend down to that in an emergency situation if we can't just get them to VFR, which, to be clear, is my preference. So keep that in mind. I'm not just plucking these out of thin air. This is perfectly legitimate in that regard. Now, if you're going to actually do this, here is the preferred technique that I have in mind. Okay, so first of all, ideally, I'd like to start from about 1,000 feet or so above the cloud layer if possible. I do have a later slide in this video about some variations, including how to do this if we are starting from within the cloud for some reason rather than on top of something like an overcast layer, but preferably start from about 1,000 feet above. One of the reasons for that is we get a nice stable descent going. The airplane's all trimmed out. We got the power set. It's nice and stable by the time we enter that overcast layer from above. And then they just can visualize that all they're doing is maintaining what the airplane was already doing while they're in the suit for a couple to a few minutes. Get any button pushing done first if possible. So if we want to set them up direct to some airport or get them set up with the tower frequency that's coming up next in advance, perhaps I would rather get that done before they start the descent into the cloud. So get any button pushing done first if possible. Get the airplane trimmed for the IMC safety speed. I have a separate video on that at. That's essentially the top of the white arc. That's the speed I would like them to descend at. Also, have the pilot complete the descent and before landing checklists as appropriate for their aircraft. If the airplane has a carbureted engine, absolutely carb heat should be on for this descent through a cloud. That's visible moisture by definition. The pitot heat should be on if available. Gear should be down if it's a retractable gear airplane. I'm not going to go into the details here, but the flaps should be up. The short version on this one is that if you put the flaps down, you don't have as much structural integrity on the flaps as you do the rest of the aircraft once flaps are deployed, and it adds in very little drag. It does change the trim speed characteristics, but flaps really don't add much drag unless you go to a lot of flaps, and there's just no need for that. I believe with flaps down, you're adding risk for essentially no benefit. I would just leave the flaps up. Discuss the expected, what I call the floor altitude with the pilot before we start the descent, and what to do if the pilot is still in instrument conditions when they get to that floor altitude. I'll elaborate on that in just a moment on a separate slide, so let's just sort of table that for the moment. Aim in the general desired direction, and wind direction is essentially irrelevant. Here's what I mean. The whole idea of the letdown procedure is we just want stability with wings level. If we're trying to do that, the pilot's heading might drift off one direction or another for a couple different reasons. And unless it really, really matters, just let that go. If they start off kind of west-ish and they slowly drift off, and kind of end up kind of southwest by the time they get out of the clouds, no big deal, right? And by the way, the wind direction is essentially irrelevant. So if we go, for example, back to this area and I pull up the current winds, so let's go to winds, and we're zoomed in on that same area, starting us at 3,000 feet MSL. You can see that the winds are ballpark 280 at 38. It's a nice breezy day, 260 at 35, 240 at 28. If we bop it up to 6,000 feet, okay, the winds are going to shift direction a little bit. That's very typical. And now we're looking at winds about 40 knots or so, down to 50 knots or so down by Phillipsburg. Now, as far as the physical controllability, spatial disorientation kind of concerns, it makes absolutely no difference what direction the airplane is going. It makes no difference whether they're going into the wind, downwind, crosswind, doesn't matter. The airplane doesn't know that the entire mass of air through which it's flying is kind of drifting from left to right, in this case, at about 40 to 50 knots. Doesn't matter. The only difference it makes at all is with the ground speed of the airplane, but we're talking about keeping the airplane up at altitude while they're in the soup, and if we lose control, it's going to have nothing to do with the ground speed. It's going to have to do with loss of airspeed during a graveyard spiral. Therefore, the wind direction is totally irrelevant. If it was me, I'd probably have them head into the wind, and the one and only reason I would do that is because as somebody is descending, and let's just assume that they're descending down here somewhere kind of west of Elmira, I suppose, that way their ground speed is low, and as a controller, we kind of know where they are with a great deal of fidelity because their ground speed is so low. But you know what? If this airplane instead is heading southeast for whatever reason, okay, their airspeed is maybe on the order of 90 to 100 knots, and they've got a 40-knot tailwind, so they're doing 140, 150 across the ground. That just means that when they pop out of the clouds, they're probably going to be over here, X miles away instead of just a short distance away. But for all intents and purposes, the wind direction is essentially irrelevant. So when it's time to do the descent, just like the airplane flying handbook talked about, you just have the pilot reduce power while keeping the wings level. The typical rule of thumb, although in reality this will vary, about 100 RPM for fixed pitch airplanes, about 1 inch of manifold pressure for airplanes with constant speed props, will typically get about 100 feet per minute. That will vary, so don't worry too much about that rule of thumb. But you just reduce power while keeping wings level. The pitch trim is going to control the airspeed, and it's pretty simple. Keep in mind the airplane flying handbook recommended a target descent rate for this situation of no more. It should never exceed 500 feet per minute. With respect, I would actually go a little bit faster descent in most cases. I would go ahead and target 500 to about 700 RPM. I put 500 on the slide so I don't get in too much trouble, right? I would feel absolutely totally comfortable at 500 to 700, I said RPM, feet per minute. The reason for not wanting to go gentler than that in most cases is because, especially if it's a thick cloud layer, if you only descend it at say 400 feet per minute and it's a 6,000 foot cloud layer, okay, you're in the soup for 7 long minutes, and that just increases the time of the threat. I would rather descend, a bit faster and get down through the clouds quicker. Okay, but about 500 to 700 feet per minute is entirely reasonable. Pilots are used to descending at that rate. It's not hard on the ears. It's perfectly normal, perfectly safe. I would therefore prefer that it's at least 300 feet per minute so we don't have the pilot spend too much time in the soup. I would not like to see more than about 1,000 feet per minute because now we're just coming down kind of extra fast. But about 500 to 700 to me is the sweet spot. So if I clearly want 500 or more and the Airplane Flying Handbook wants 500 or less, maybe we just compromise, call it 500, and we're good with that. That'll certainly work. Okay, and then this one, it might be just a tad controversial, so let me address this. Gentle turns, and I mean preferably a maximum 10-degree bank angle, but gentle turns are, in my mind, absolutely totally permitted. Now, the reason I say that's controversial, if we go back to the Airplane Flying Handbook, and I have color-coded this one with some yellow highlighter, right after the section about descents, it talks about combined maneuvers. Combined maneuvers, such as climbing or descending turns, here we're in a descent, I'm talking about turning the airplane, so combined maneuvers should be avoided if at all possible by an untrained instrument pilot already under the stress of an emergency situation. I absolutely am 100% on board with the intent behind this and the principle behind it. However, in the detailed application, I think this is misguided for something like this letdown procedure. Here's why. Again, kind of going back to this. All you do is you pull the power back, okay, a few inches of manifold pressure or a few hundred RPM. You get your descent going about 500 feet per minute. The airplane's doing all the work. The pitch trim's holding the airspeed. All you got to do is hold the wings level. And it just takes a small amount of concentration to hold the wings level, and if the heading wanders around a little bit, so it's not a big deal. Now, for our purposes, if for some reason the pilot starts to drift off in some particular direction, we would like to remind them to keep the wings level so they don't get into a graveyard spiral, but now they may be on some new heading. If they are heading towards something like higher terrain or something else that's bad, and we need to kind of get them back in that other direction, get them away from whatever threat they're now facing at their 12 o'clock, okay, can we turn them? Yeah. You just do a 10-degree bank in that desired direction. The airplane's still going to descend at about 500 feet per minute. It doesn't change any of this. I'm absolutely on board with this prohibition, as it were, about climbing and descending turns, where you're having somebody, let's say, descend and maintain 4,000 feet, turn left heading 330. Okay, now you're giving somebody 2 targets. They're having to process 2 separate things, one lateral, one vertical. How are you going to do that? That can absolutely overwhelm an untrained instrument pilot. They don't have the mental reserve under the stress of that situation without specialized training to do that. But this is just bone simple, and if you add a gentle 10-degree bank turn for a little while to get away from some threat while they're doing the descent, that is absolutely totally doable, and I have no qualm about that whatsoever. If, on the other hand, you say, sorry, Dean, nice try, but we can't do this because that's a combined maneuver, what you're advocating then is if somebody does turn and they're now heading towards something threatening, and so you want to turn them back away from that in whatever direction, implicitly you're saying we've got to have them stop the descent, so they're going to have to add power, maintain altitude. You're now giving them a target. Now they're going to make the turn, get on the heading that is going to get away from the threat, and then they got to reduce power once again and get this descent over. You're going to spend more time in the soup with that technique than what I'm advocating for. You're making it harder because you're giving the pilot more targets, including leveling off, maintaining altitude during a turn. I argue in good faith this is absolutely better than staying away from this because you read about something about combined maneuvers. So I'm 100% on board with the combined maneuvers in principle. However, in the letdown maneuver, if you've got to turn them, just do a gentle turn. It's perfectly fine. All right. I told you we'd talk about the floor altitude. So first let's talk about the floor altitude. First of all, you've got to pick what I have in mind as a floor altitude. The floor altitude to me is equivalent in effect to something like an MDA on a non-precision approach, a minimum descent altitude. If you get there and haven't broken out, then you do want to level off, okay? The floor altitude that we should pick is expected to be below the clouds but above the local terrain. Hopefully whatever MEA, MVA, MIA is appropriate in that area is going to meet that need. Typically speaking, in most areas, the MEA, I'm just going to call it the MEA is going to be something like 1,000 feet above local obstacles, which tend to be, these small towers on the order of 200 feet or less. So it tends to be about 1,200-ish feet above much of the terrain, at least in the relatively flat parts of the country. By the way, that's one of the reasons, effectively, why the Class G airspace differentiates at about 1,200 feet. That happens to correspond more or less with a typical MEA. But if you can do something like that, which you can in a good chunk of the country, that's a reasonable floor altitude. In mountainous terrain or in areas where you have some higher obstacles and so on, I am talking, quite frankly, about possibly picking a floor altitude that's below the MEA. But now and again, in an emergency, keep in mind that we're searching for what is least bad. In some hilly areas, okay, and that's officially part of the mountainous, terrain of some part of the country, that 2,000 foot above the hills can be a little conservative, and normally that's fine. However, if because of that you feel like, oh, we have no choice and we can never descend this poor pilot, now we kind of get stuck. So there's going to be a judgment call in those kinds of areas. But generally speaking, something like the MEA, MVA, MIA is going to be suitable for a floor altitude. But there's no point really in picking a floor altitude unless you expect it to be below the cloud ceiling. Okay. So if you're picking something and you have reason to suspect that's in the clouds, it's like, why are you even trying this maneuver in the first place? So therefore, if somebody gets to the floor altitude and levels off because they're still IMC, first of all, I'd hope that we're a little surprised, because the whole point of the floor altitude is something that is underneath what we expect the cloud layer to be. And so when they get there, they should level off, and then there's basically three options. I'll talk about my preferred option, certainly, but one option is to climb back up. I would not like to do this, okay? Maybe only do it through a relatively thin cloud layer. So here somebody has to level off. Now they got to reinitiate the climb. Now they got to go back up again, through the soup. So they're spending more time in it. And now they're back to where we started. All right. So generally speaking, the climb back up, to me, it's an option, but it's not a good option. Pause, then continue. So here we're talking about somebody who levels off at that floor altitude. Now this floor altitude, A, we're probably a little surprised that we've gotten there and it's still IMC. B, they might be able to look kind of straight down, by looking out their left side window typically, and they can kind of make out the ground by looking vertically, even though out in front of them it's all gray cloud, something like that. You'd want to be very careful with this, but you can kind of pause and then say, you know what, let's move the floor altitude down just 100 or 200 feet and just do a very gentle descent. Earlier I recommended don't do a gentle descent, but here a gentle descent, just a couple hundred feet a minute is fine. Just kind of work your way down a couple hundred feet more, maybe as much as a few hundred feet more, to something that I'm going to loosely label a somewhat more aggressive floor altitude. Now maybe this is a floor altitude that's below the MEA, MVA, MIA. Again, now we're introducing risk, but in the first place, we've already been a little surprised by the clouds for some reason. Pause, then land. I do not like this, but this is kind of the option of last resort. Here, this is something where we level briefly, and it seems like for whatever reason, we were very surprised by the weather. The weather is much worse than what we were expecting, and therefore, instead of climbing back up through a 6,000 foot cloud layer or something like that, it might be that we're just going to go ahead and consider a precautionary off-airport landing. In effect, what you do there is just start a gentle descent, and I will talk about that in a separate video about the VFR-in-IMC precautionary off-airport landing, aka the rural crash procedure. But basically the idea there is start a gentle descent, and you can add flaps at that point. And you're expecting kind of an off-airport landing. But I think basically, A, we should be surprised about getting to the floor altitude and not being out of the soup. B, generally speaking, just pause, typically a gentle descent, and we're either going to reach VMC a little lower than we expected, or this is going to go all the way to an off-airport landing. In a worst-case scenario, some of these might be pause, then continue. You get down a couple hundred feet, you're still at this more aggressive floor altitude, still in the soup. Now we kind of switch to pause, then land, so that might cascade a little bit. For what it's worth, this emergency letdown maneuver has in effect been done before. One example of that was the 2015 Southwest Region Archie League Award winner. For what it's worth, it was also the President's Award winner that year. I'm going to watch the introduction and replay of that presentation at the Communicating for Safety conference. This is going to be a longer clip than I usually play. This will be about 5 minutes to just play about 30 seconds or so of introduction and then watch the radar replay.
One of those. On September 16th, 2014, November 485er Golf was at 8500 VFR, VFR only rated pilot, and he needed to get down to land. There was an 8,000-foot thick layer of clouds beneath him, and with the management concurrence, Hugh McFarland, who's in his 26th year as an air traffic controller and also an experienced pilot, guided him down. And as you'll hear from the audio, which really tells a story, beyond just the controller instructions, Hugh used his pilot experience to assist the pilot all the way down, keep him calm, make sure he kept his wings level. And I'll just let the audio speak for itself. Let's listen to it.
If I don't go off, okay. And let's go ahead and start our descent whenever you're ready, and just keep the plane just centered up there on a 180 heading, and keep the wings level. That's the most important thing, is the wings level. And when you're ready, there's about maybe a 300 to 400 RPM reduction in the power, and set up for about a 500 or less descent rate.
500 go. Descending through the clouds. Thank you.
If I go off, you're doing great. Just keep the wings nice and level, and airspeed at about 85 to 90 knots. Enriching the mixture just a little bit more. Not all the way, but just a little bit. If I go off, if you're having to apply carburetor heat, go ahead and pull the carburetor heat knob out.
Carburetor heat has been out. Thank you.
If I go off, doing great. About another 500 feet to go. And just continue southbound, heading 180. Wings nice and level at 180. And just maintain 2,000 when you get there. About another 500 feet to go. If I go off, when you're ready, just make a standard rate turn to the left. It'll be just about a 10 to 15 degrees of bank to the left, and to a 090 heading. Just do eastbound. Just nice gradual turn, and use the turn coordinator in your attitude or indicator to make just an easy turn to the left, about 15 degrees of bank. Or 500 off. Okay, when you can, now just a nice gradual left turn to a 020 heading.
Okay, I'm showing 020 at 2,000 feet, 500 off.
500 off. Okay, just fly that 020 heading for a little bit longer, and just wings level. Just relax and breathe. Just relax. You're doing fine. Just keep the wings level, and then when you're ready, slight right bank, 15 degrees to a 360 heading.
I'm out to go, Roger.
But the most important thing is just maintain 2,000 and 90 knots, 500 off. Or 500 off. When you get leveled up there on 360 heading, is that where you're at now, sir?
I'm trying.
Or 500 off. And when you can, now once you're heading northbound on 360 heading, slight reduction in power, and set up your final descent to about 700 feet, and that'll get you below the clouds, and you'll see the airport. It'll be right off to your 12 o'clock position. So go ahead and slight reduction in power, about 300 RPM off, and 90 knot into descent. Okay, you're just about there. Just to keep the wings nice and level, and just another 100 feet or so, and you're out of the bases.
Okay, I see the ground.
Okay, just level off there at you're about 700 to 800 feet above the ground, or MSL, and push the direct 2 button if you can, but just keep the wings nice and level. Or if I never go off, you're about 6 miles southwest of the airport, so fly heading 020, and you're going to see the runway off to your 1 o'clock position there. You're about 5.5 miles away.
Yes, I'm still tracking towards the TMA, and it's showing 3 miles.
So it should be, you're about 3 miles south. You should see a large interstate east and west, which is south of the airport. The airport is north of the freeway, and it runs north and south.
You say I-10 is south of the airport, is that correct?
If I go off, affirmative. The I-10 is south of the airport, about 1.5 miles, and it runs east and west. And so the airport would be perpendicular north and south orientation.
I found the airport. I think I'm going to make it. Thank you.
Yes, contact TME Tower on 126.9 or 7 for 500 golf. Good job.
Nice, calm voice. Well done. Essentially, that's the letdown procedure. It's tempting to talk about some of the differences, but I'll leave that for some other day, perhaps. Also, if you're interested, you can see the case study video about John and Martha King's 1975 South Dakota forced landing that I have up on the case studies and simulations page of the website. What they did in part during that flight, you'll have to watch the video to find out the details. Essentially, they got into something akin to a VFR-in-IMC situation. They went down to a floor altitude, chose to climb back up, realized they were kind of stuck in the same situation. They were running out of options, so they went down again to the floor altitude, did basically the pause and continue, then the pause and forced landing situation. So slightly different setup, and they were doing that on their own for reasons you'll have to understand in the video, but effectively this has been done before. Okay, let's talk briefly about some typical variations. What I have in mind here is the fact that we're not always going to have a VFR pilot in an instrument-capable airplane stuck on top of an overcast layer. So I have in mind 4 basic variations. One is what to do if they're starting from within IMC, so they're in the layer rather than above it. What if they have the autopilot turned on and they're going to use the autopilot? What if it's an instrument-rated pilot in a vacuum pump failure situation, aka partial panel? And then also about the really nasty situation where it's somebody who's VFR only or IFR rated who's in a VFR only airplane, doesn't have the full instrumentation set that's needed for instrument flight. Okay, so when starting from within IMC, it's essentially the same maneuver. I wouldn't do the button pushing up front or the checklist up front. We might kind of abbreviate the checklist and focus on things like getting the gear down, the carb heat on, pitot heat on, but essentially just ease the power back gently. While doing that, I would recommend gently trimming the airplane more nose up to the IMC safety speed, aka the top of the white arc, if they haven't already done so, but just ease the power back, ease it back a little more, ease it back a little more, get to about 500 feet per minute, and other than that, it's essentially the same thing. The autopilot on is essentially the same thing. The only difference is that when you're using the autopilot, particularly if you use the vertical speed mode, which is the mode that I would prefer for this situation, then you'll use the throttle, aka the power, to control the airspeed. So as you manipulate the autopilot to start the descent down to about 500, 600, 700 feet per minute, you just need to bring the throttle back to keep the airspeed where it's at. If it's an IFR airplane and IFR rated pilot, but they've had a vacuum pump failure, then the only real difference is just use the turn coordinator to keep the wings level. And if for some reason you want to do a gentle turn, we can't tell them keep it below 10 degrees bank because they've lost their attitude indicator. I would recommend keeping turns to just half standard rate. A lot of you might think you can keep the turns to standard rate, and that's fine. I prefer to keep a nice gentle bank in these situations. I would just keep it half standard rate. You can go a little more than that if you want. Now, what about the really nasty situation with the VFR-only airplane? So again, this is somebody who's in a Piper Cub or something, and there just isn't the attitude information. There isn't a turn coordinator to help keep the wings level. What in the world are we going to do? Keep in mind, as always, my preferred strategy is keep them VFR, but for the sake of discussion, let's assume this is somebody who flew up above the cloud layer and kind of expected that it was going to be improving, and then they show up, they're getting low on fuel, and just it's thickened up, it's overcast or something like that, and now they're just stuck, and we don't really have a choice. So, first of all, this is a life-threatening situation. Generally speaking, this letdown procedure is going to have very high survival odds. Frankly, this is not going to have good survival odds. We're just running out of options. I'm going to present 2 possible options that will depend a little bit on the airplane and what the pilot's comfort level is. If you have any more that I haven't thought of, trust me, I'll greatly appreciate it, and I'll give you full credit. Here are the 2 options. So one is use the magnetic compass on basically an east or a west heading for indirect bank guidance and control the bank with rudder only. In other words, let's just focus on the magnetic compass and controlling bank with rudder only. The idea is if you start, again, we're starting from over the cloud layer in this case, start with wings level, get the descent going, and as long as you just kind of stay on that heading and just use gentle pressure on the rudder, It's not perfect. It is kind of an indirect bank indication, but it's the best that's available. I think that the pilot has a good fighting chance to not enter a graveyard spiral. The reason for doing this on an east or west heading is because of the compass errors. If you are on a north heading or a south heading, the magnetic compass has big errors. On an east or west heading, it does not have those same kinds of turning errors, the lead lag errors, the undershoot overshoot errors, depending on what pilots prefer to call it. The only thing I would caution if we're going to do this is, remember, if you're looking at the magnetic compass, you're looking at the back of the instrument. And so if the magnetic compass seems to be showing, just from eyeballing it, a turn to the right, that's actually a turn to the left. It's not a big deal. Just prep for the fact that the pilot needs to think about that. If they get that rock in the wrong hand, they might get into a graveyard spiral. But again, that's really just about the only thing we have, except for one other option. Some of you are not going to like this. Let me preface this with a true story involving a couple friends of mine. And you hear, friends, it's code for Dean did this himself. No, this is really some friends of mine from a long, long time ago. Long story short, Don and John, they hopped in a Citabria, and Don called Phoenix Approach at one point. They expected it to be a decent day out in Arizona, which it usually is, and it just kind of got kind of murky and cloudy. And so Don called Phoenix Approach, and he said, hey, this is Citabria so-and-so. I'm instrument rated. I'm in an instrument-capable airplane. I'd like to pick up some vectors and et cetera, et cetera. And then so Phoenix Approach says, okay, roger, and gives him an IFR clearance, and everything's all fine. He's in the suit being vectored by Phoenix Approach. Now, at this point, you're going, well, if he's IFR-capable and IFR-equipped airplane, then what's the point of telling this? Here's why. Because everything was perfectly normal right up until Don told Phoenix Approach, he says, hey, if you don't mind, would you mark my position? And Phoenix Approach says, why? And Don said, because the glider I was towing just released. Here's what happened. Don and John hopped in the Citabria when 100 miles or so away to pick up a glider that had just come out of some annual maintenance, and we're flying back. So John was in the glider, Don was flying the tow plane. Don never bothered to tell Phoenix Approach he was towing a glider in this entire situation. And from John's perspective in the glider, he's back there and they get into the soup and he's able to see the tow plane the whole time. And so even though in the glider he only has basic VFR instrumentation, he can see the tow plane. So at least in principle, he can, as long as he keeps, his wings and, kind of pointed and level with the tow plane wings, it should be okay, right? That's all well and good until it just gets murkier and murkier and murkier in the thick cloud, and he can no longer see the tow plane. He can kind of make that the tow rope goes off in the distance, and theoretically it's still attached to the tow plane out there, even if you can't see it, but that didn't last very long. John knew he was getting out of position, and he had no choice but to release. So no comm, no instrumentation other than the basic VFR instrumentation. Here's poor John on the glider. What's he going to do? And he did the absolute perfect thing for that particular glider. Are you ready? Drum roll, please. He pulled the stick all the way back and stomped on left full rudder. Folks, do you know what happens when you bring the stick all the way back and stomp left rudder or right rudder full? You go into a deliberate spin in most airplanes. In that particular glider, that was absolutely the perfect thing to do, because even though it's a wild ride, it is a stable situation. The speed stays low. Now, not all airplanes can be spun. I want to be clear about that. But given a pilot who's willing to do this and is familiar with spins, which I can vouch John was, and in an airplane or a glider that is capable of spins, not all are, that was actually the preferred maneuver for him to do. He held the spin in the soup until he popped out the bottom at about 1,000 AGL, quickly recovered, and then because it's a glider, he had to just land in a field somewhere and then go find what airport Don landed at so he could go beat Don up. So, in all seriousness, on a rational level, given the right pilot and right airplane, this is actually something that could be done, but I almost can't really see doing that. That's like the triple advanced bag of tricks if there's just absolutely no other option, but please just never ever do that. If it's a VFR only airplane, the only two strategies I can think of are using that magnetic compass with controlling the bank with rudder only, or maybe an intentional spin, but either way, that's truly a life-threatening situation. But believe it or not, that true incident is in effect where I got the idea for this emergency letdown procedure, because at the end of the day, though it was a wild ride, it was a stable descent through the clouds, getting down below the clouds, and then making a nice VFR landing, albeit in that case in a field. All right, let's wrap up. If you're interested and you have programming skills, talk to me about building a website simulator. I won't go into the details here, but what I loosely have in mind is a training app on the website in which we could simulate being the controller, talking a pilot through these situations and assessing the weather situations. I'm just going to leave that here. One thing I would like to do, I'm not going to do it yet, is film some videos in the flight simulator about this letdown maneuver. At the moment, though, Microsoft's new flight simulator, the weather is a little more geared, in my mind, towards kind of eye candy visuals rather than good hard IMC, where I can set it up the way I want. Therefore, when the weather engine for the flight sim improves, I am intending on filming some videos. In the meantime, I'm going to table that for later. And then in summary, folks, this is quite simple to fly. The letdown maneuver is something of a, wait for it, a letdown in terms of drama. At the end of the day, you basically just keep the wings level in most cases, pull the power back. You do have a couple things to think about, but you should pop out of the clouds before you get to your floor altitude. It's VFR, at least marginal VFR, and then they just maneuver to a safe landing. Therefore, I fully expect a near perfect survival rate when we use this technique as described in this video, including the weather minimums. If you start to go meaningfully off script from what I have in mind, you're on your own if this doesn't work out. I will note also that if there's icing in those clouds or convective activity, that is clearly going to affect the survival rate. But unless you have something like that, I actually expect that as long as you do it essentially the way that I've talked about in this video, including adhering to those weather minimums before we attempt this, I expect a near perfect survival rate. So keep this in mind as a tool that might be appropriate in some cases to use for some of these VFR and IMC situations. Thank you.